Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Sophomore English. We continue in our study in Unit 3 of essay writing, the nonfiction work that we're looking at. We just finished with that powerful statement by Elie Wiesel about the need to not keep silent, the need to remember the past. We now turn to the great Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I'm with you on page 547. And his acceptance of the Nobel Prize and his statement about that. However, before we get there on 547, I want to go back to 539. Write this down in 2B really quickly. We are concentrating on persuasive writing now, and more particularly persuasive speeches, using arguments and, again, the rhetorical devices of repetition, of parallelism. We saw these again in our last study with Wiesel. Well, the slogans, the saws, the rhetorical questions, to allow for then persuasive techniques to be in play. That chart at the bottom of 539, important for us. The vocabulary in 546 will end up on the assessment. We want to make sure we know that. Let's meet Solzhenitsyn on page 547. 1918 to 2008 are his dates. He was a Russian writer. We've already met Tolstoy. Here's another Russian writer. A Russian writer, Solzhenitsyn, spent years in prison camps because of his political views. Yet he was never intimidated into silence. He experienced the hardship of being a dissident, someone who publicly disagrees with an established system. During the Second World War, Solzhenitsyn was imprisoned for writing letters to a friend that were critical of the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. In his first novel, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denovich, he described the harsh climate, backbreaking work, and poor diet at the camp at which he was imprisoned. In 1974, after the publication in Paris of parts of his Gulag, Solzhenitsyn was tried for treason and exiled. Both of these titles, by the way, must-reads. Really, to understand the 20th century, you really need to read both of them. In 1994, 3 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, he returned to his homeland. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1970. That's huge. The background for this speech on page 547 in the box: a writer in exile. By writing critically about the USSR, now Russia, and other nations, Alexander Solzhenitsyn faced punishment and censorship. As he explains in his Nobel Lecture, writers and publishers around the world offered their support. When Solzhenitsyn was exiled in 1974, he was first welcomed by fellow author and Nobel Prize winner Heinrich Böll. Let's take a look now at this speech, in which Solzhenitsyn, will reflect upon the importance of literature that bears witness, that represents what happened in the past, so that we don't forget. Writers whose voices override lies, and the readers who respond and align with them. Again, not a long read, but a powerful read. Let's pay attention now to this one and enjoy this presentation as well.
From Nobel Lecture by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, translated by F.D. Reeve. I am, however, encouraged by a keen sense of world literature as the one great heart that beats for the cares and misfortunes of our world, even though each corner sees and experiences them in a different way. In past times also, besides age-old national literatures, there existed a concept of world literature as the link between the summits of national literatures and as the aggregate of reciprocal literary influences.
549.
But there was a time lag. Readers and writers came to know foreign writers only belatedly, sometimes centuries later, so that mutual influences were delayed, and the network of national literary high points was visible not to contemporaries, but to later generations. Today, between writers of one country and the readers and writers of another, there is an almost instantaneous reciprocity, as I myself know. My books, unpublished, alas, in my own country, despite hasty and often bad translations, have quickly found a responsive world readership. Critical analysis of them has been undertaken by such leading Western writers as Heinrich Böll. During all these recent years, when both my work and my freedom did not collapse, when against the laws of gravity they held on, seemingly in thin air, seemingly on nothing, on the invisible, mute surface tension of sympathetic people, with warm gratitude I learned, to my complete surprise, of the support of the world's writing fraternity. On my 50th birthday, I was astounded to receive greetings from well-known European writers. No pressure put on me now passed unnoticed. During the dangerous weeks when I was being expelled from the Writers' Union, the protective wall put forward by the prominent writers of the world saved me from worse persecution, and Norwegian writers and artists hospitably prepared shelter for me in the event that I was exiled from my country. Finally, my being nominated for a Nobel Prize was originally not in the land where I live and write, but by Francois Mauriac and his colleagues. Afterward, national writers' organizations expressed unanimous support for me. As I have understood it and experienced it myself, world literature is no longer an abstraction or a generalized concept invented by literary critics, but a common body and common spirit, a living, heartfelt unity reflecting the growing spiritual unity of mankind. State borders still turn crimson, heated red-hot by electric fences and machine gun fire. Some ministries of internal affairs still suppose that literature is an internal affair of the countries under their jurisdiction. And newspaper headlines still herald, "They have no right to interfere in our internal affairs." Meanwhile, no such thing as internal affairs remains on our crowded earth. Mankind's salvation lies exclusively in everyone's making everything his business, in the people of the East being anything but indifferent to what is thought in the West, and in the people of the West being anything but indifferent to what happens in the East.
550.
Literature, one of the most sensitive and responsive tools of human existence, has been the first to pick up, adopt, and assimilate this sense of the growing unity of mankind. I therefore confidently turn to the world literature of the present, to hundreds of friends whom I have not met face to face and perhaps never will see. My friends, let us try to be helpful if we are worth anything. In our own countries, torn by differences among parties, movements, castes, and groups, who for ages past has been not the dividing but the uniting force? This, essentially, is the position of writers, spokesmen of a national language, of the chief tie binding the nation, the very soil which the people inhabit, and in fortunate circumstances, the nation's spirit too. I think that world literature has the power in these frightening times to help mankind see itself accurately despite what is advocated by partisans and by parties. It has the power to transmit the condensed experience of one region to another, so that different scales of values are combined, and so that one people accurately and concisely knows the true history of another with a power of recognition and acute awareness, as if it had lived through that history itself, and could thus be spared repeating old mistakes.
551.
At the same time, perhaps we ourselves may succeed in developing our own worldwide view, like any man, with the center of the eye seeing what is nearby, but the periphery of vision taking in what is happening in the rest of the world. We will make correlations and maintain worldwide standards. Who, if not writers, are to condemn their own unsuccessful governments? In some states, this is the easiest way to make a living. Everyone who is not too lazy does it, as well as society itself, whether for its cowardly humiliation or for its self-satisfied weakness, or the light-hearted escapades of the young, or the youthful pirates brandishing knives. We will be told, what can literature do against the pitiless onslaught of naked violence? Let us not forget that violence does not and cannot flourish by itself.
Right.
It is inevitably intertwined with lying. Between them, there is the closest, the most profound and natural bond. Nothing screens violence except lies, and the only way lies can hold out is by violence. Whoever has once announced violence as his method must inexorably choose lying as his principle. At birth, violence behaves openly and even proudly. But as soon as it becomes stronger and firmly established, it senses the thinning of the air around it and cannot go on without befogging itself in lies, coating itself with lying's sugary oratory. It does not always or necessarily go straight for the gullet. Usually it demands of its victims only allegiance to the lie, only complicity in the lie.
552.
The simple act of an ordinary courageous man is not to take part, not to support lies. Let that come into the world and even reign over it, but not through me. Writers and artists can do more. They can vanquish lies. In the struggle against lies, art has always won and always will. Conspicuously, incontestably for everyone. Lies can stand up against much in the world, but not against art. Once lies have been dispelled, the repulsive nakedness of violence will be exposed, and hollow violence will collapse. That, my friends, is why I think we can help the world in its red-hot hour. Not by the naysaying of having no armaments, not by abandoning oneself to the carefree life, but by going into battle. In Russian, proverbs about truth are favorites. They persistently express the considerable, bitter, grim experience of the people, often astonishingly. One word of truth outweighs the world. On such a seemingly fantastic violation of the law of the conservation of mass and energy are based both my own activities and my appeal to the writers of the whole world.
All right, this is a compelling speech. By the way, this is not the full speech. It's only a part of that speech. Let's go through it, though, at level 1 really quickly and get a sense of how it is that he's working. First of all, let's make sure we understand the schemata. He plays a game, which is not unusual, of past, present, future. Do you notice this? So first he's going to talk about some elements of the past, then he's going to talk about issues of the present, and then finally he's going to end his speech by talking about elements of the future. Let's begin at the beginning. Notice he begins with world literature. The idea that in the time he's living, finally, because of the technologies that are available, finally there can be such a thing as world literature, where everybody knows from different cultures what's going on in those other cultures. He says in the past, this was not the case. In the past, there used to be an understanding that there were German writers, there were Spanish writers, there were French writers, there were Brazilian writers, and they all kind of wrote within their own country. And nobody really appreciated what was going on in those other places. Now, he says, it's quite a different... we've become an aggregate, a collection, if you will, right? Now he speaks about the present and a watching world. And for him, it was personal. Notice the reflective element. He says, for me, when terrible things started happening to me, it was amazing how the other great writers of the world, I'm getting information, letters from them and that kind of thing. And he says, I began to feel like I was a part of a larger community. Then he turns on page 549 to his comment about the future. He says that the future that's coming is going to build itself around its artists and its writers. That is to say, we're not going to allow for this internal affair thing to happen anymore. He even calls, on page 550, he even calls literature a tool. Then he calls to his friends. He says it's time that we are spokesmen of a national language. He uses the word power in that last paragraph on 550 twice. His argument is two things. One, let's learn from history. And two, literature should be like a mirror that will in fact represent the horrors and of course the courageous acts of those who fight against the horror. We have a worldwide view on page 551, which takes us, of course, to that notion of moral development. When we're very young, we have a very egocentric view. I will do whatever I want. I don't care what anybody else wants. Egocentric. We then recognize that, no, you can't be a little Nazi. You have to conform to certain kinds of group expectations. We call this an ethnocentric view. In other words, what my group says is the right way. But we become more, and here the worldview, we become increasingly aware as we get older, or so we should, that because of the way we were raised, because of the things we were taught, we have certain views that others maybe don't share in the same way. That is what we call a world-centric view. And it's Solzhenitsyn's insight that this is where the world is headed, especially the world of artists and writers and the like. Notice he asks the rhetorical question, who, on page 551, if not writers, are to condemn their own unsuccessful governments? I mean, who else can do it other than the artists, the writers, right? He talks then finally about the power of lying and the importance for writers to tell the truth and stand up. This will remind us of what MLK said in his famous statement. Oppressed peoples respond to oppression in three characteristic ways. One, acquiescence. They just give up and accept it. Two, corroding hatred and violence. But he makes the observation, quoting Gandhi, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Well then, if you can't just sit there and take it, oppression, and you can't fight back with your 12 gauge, what is the other option? The third option for MLK, he says, is non-violent resistance, that Hegelian synthesis, as he calls it, the bringing together of the two. Here, Solzhenitsyn playing a very similar game. To finish, he sounds very much like Elie Wiesel, doesn't he? Where he says, don't be silent. You have to stand up. You have to believe that in the end, art and writers and artists can win. One word of truth outweighs the world. Let's jump to 2A quickly. What is for you the major theme messages here? A couple maybe come to mind, just like our study of the Wiesel text. A personal reading, a sociological, political reading. Of course, at the political side, the idea that we have to take care of the entire world. We can't just live in our own little safe place and not pay attention to the horrific things that are happening other parts of the world. Because tragically, after, for example, this speech was given 20 years later in 1994 in Rwanda, 1 million people died in 100 days. And nobody stepped in the world to try and stop it. Afterwards, large numbers of people in the world went back to a speech like this and said, we let Rwanda down, but we let the rest of the world down. It's the role of the artist to stand up and speak against the lie. That is the job, right? Of course, at the personal level, notice again here, we're having a personal challenge to stand up for what is right, for what is true, for what is good, right? Of course, we have all kinds of rhetorical devices. We already mentioned the rhetorical use of the rhetorical question, a question that we obviously know the answer to. He asks it, if writers don't stand up, who will? The persuasion that is clearly a part of this, persuading us to believe in the power of art, to somehow unify the world for the good and not for the bad. At 3A, what are some of the titles that for you stand out here? How do the two titles that we've just looked at, Elie Wiesel's text and Solzhenitsyn's text, how do you see them as very similar? A call to action, an appreciation that the world is clearly changing, and yet in some ways hasn't changed. There's always going to be violence because it's associated with lying, and we have to stand up to the lying. I mentioned Martin Luther King's famous essay, Oppressed Peoples Respond to Oppression in Three Characteristic Ways. You should look that one up. That's a compelling one. Of course, others will put another speech here, like Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, as a powerful correlate example. What's the text for you, the song on your playlist that says, you got to stand up for the right. You got to stand up for the good. And if you say to me, I don't have songs like that on my playlist, Solzhenitsyn would say, something's wrong. Something's wrong. You've been infected with that egocentrism that can only lead to your own demise and to the world's demise. You have to stand up and you have to be a part of this world because this world is expecting you to be a part of the world. And finally at 3B, to what degree are you challenged by something like this? In two ways. The artists that you are attracted to, who do you listen to? Who do you watch? Do they build within you a sense of community, or do they build within you a sense of isolation? If they're not building a sense of community, we're all a part of this world, you might want to begin to rethink as a sophomore the kind of artists you expose yourself to. Because we are the stories. Remember, we've said this many times. We are the stories we tell, the stories we retell, the stories we accept, the stories we reject. On what ground are you accepting or not accepting those stories? And then finally, what are you doing personally, within your own community, your state, your nation, your world, to try to make this world a better place, to leave this world a more awakened, a more mindful, a more compassionate place And the only way that happens, as both Elie Wiesel as well as Solzhenitsyn point out, the only way that happens is to be a part of this world, to be in this world, right? Well, I hope that you've been challenged as well by Solzhenitsyn. Remarkable, remarkable writer. I hope you pick up some of his stuff to read as well. Thank you.